we have ourselves a quorum for sure.
Yes, we do have a quorum. We're being recorded, and our first action would be just to approve the minutes of the last meeting. I've looked at them, they look fine. And wondering if anybody has any concerns that they want to, all right, hearing none, they are deemed to be approved. Our principal agenda item for today is to hear about the modeling from Cadmus and EFG. And I'm not sure in what order you folks want to present, but David, are you the principal? All right, well, let's turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Let's see. Okay, let me get that on you. Is that sharing the screen for everybody?
Yeah, we're seeing your presentation mode, not necessarily the slides, which.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry
probably
about that.
It's all right.
Let me shift this over then. Here. And is that now? Still doing the same thing?
Yeah.
You're doing
David,
good.
if you go up to display settings up top with the drop down there, you should be able to switch.
Sorry about this.
Swap. Yep.
Swap presenter and
There you go.
Hooray.
thank you.
It's only taken us all a year and a half to, I had no idea that existed. That would have been really helpful a long time ago.
I've had that problem myself.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We look forward to the discussion today and appreciate the feedback and the inputs that we've gotten along the way. What we want to do today is really present the details on how we have looked at building upon the LEAP model, low emissions analysis platform is the model developed by SEI that's being used to support both the comprehensive energy plan and the climate action plan. And part of our scope of work was to analyze and build upon the analyses that have been completed by the state, the Public Service Department, and the Stockholm Environment Institute to date. So review those and build upon them so that the pathways analysis, the LEAP model can best support the pathways analysis that goes into the climate action plan. So where we are, we have a deliverable a week from today that is a memo summarizing the material that I'll go over today and an Excel table that has all of the recommended changes. These have all been shared. All the items that we'll be discussing today have been shared with SEI already, and many of them are, they're underway, potentially the changes that we're recommending, recognizing the timelines and everything, but we will have a specific written deliverable with a single Excel workbook that documents all of this, that talks about what's in the model, the recommendations that we are making, and the potential importance for those in terms of the pathways. And then looking forward, November, I think this should be November 15th, sorry, task 4B, the draft and the final pathways report. There are also along the line there are presentations from you all to the Vermont Climate Council on the 26th, et cetera, but we will be developing a written report that then goes into more detail on each of the pathways and the different time periods and the related policies, programs, and initiatives that are needed to support, build upon what the state currently does, and then also to support achieving the paths that are represented in the modeling. And so that's a more extensive 50-page type report. The work next week will be kind of more in a memo format and with an Excel workbook. So approach to the pathways analyses, shared this before, but assess and build upon the existing model. There will be one model that will be helpful for the state that will support both the comprehensive energy plan and the climate action plan. So these are, building on the scenarios, tweaking some of the inputs and assumptions that are in the existing work for the CEP. Our work is focused on identifying some potential gaps. Those types of gaps can either be additional strategies or measures or categories. In some cases, there are assumptions and inputs that we've looked at and reviewed, things related to the depth and the pace of emissions reductions or adoption of mitigation options, the cost and performance for different technologies or options, and then also think about how these are related to supporting policies and initiatives that are required to reach these targets. Some critical questions that we've addressed is, the modeling. Is the LEAP modeling consistent with the inventory? And the slide there, or the graphic on the right, illustrates that what's in the LEAP and the baseline mitigation for 2018 emissions inventory is in blue and the inventory is in orange. So these are very close. They're not absolutely exactly the same. And one of the things that I'd like to just pause here and provide a little bit of context is that as we go through this, I really want to emphasize how much Vermont is doing and how well we're doing with analysis of all of this. As just a comparison, participating in a process that's similar for a Midwestern state that has greenhouse gas emissions that are well over 20 times greater than Vermont's emissions. So over 160 million tons a year. They have, from their governor, a climate council and a directive to come back with a plan. They've been having stakeholder meetings. There've been a series of 18, 19 stakeholder meetings this year. The recommendations that they're providing, or the work that a lot of those groups have done, they really don't have the type of quantitative analysis and really the depth that we're looking at. Recommendations that different task groups have been working on there are limited to kind of 250 words. And the inputs to the Climate Council there are 5 recommendations overall. And really those are to start doing planning and analysis in the same areas that we've been looking at. But I just want to emphasize how sometimes I think in the process in Vermont, it may be difficult to realize how progressive, how dedicated, how skilled, how much goes in from the work that's gone on in the inventory with the Agency of Natural Resources, all the different departments and people that are working on these things. I just want us to keep that in mind when, as we move forward. The climate action plan and the initiatives I think that we're working on are well supported by analyses, and it's good to appreciate that. A second really big point is, do the scenarios meet the GWSA targets? And the next slide, I'll illustrate this a little bit, but yes, I mean, we basically, the LEAP analyses that have been conducted do meet the Global Warming Solutions Act targets. And so we have a pretty detailed, the LEAP model allows you to build out many branches, many devices, a lot of granularity. We have models that to first order meet the targets and help us understand, building upon the work that has been done by Energy Action Networks, the different sub-working groups, all these things. We really have some good analytic foundation for how do we, what does it take to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act targets. The sectors generally, not in all cases in all years, but generally sectoral targets are also met. And then one of the things we'll review today is, well, what are the means by which we're meeting those those targets. You know, for the transportation sector, currently it meets the targets. It's largely through the electric vehicles and some biofuels. Another important question, are there how consistent and or gaps between what we've heard from you all in our discussions with your task leads and with in some of these presentations before, some of the group meetings, expectations about what you'd like to see involved in a climate action plan, the discussions that are going on, and what's in the model. If we're modeling something that's significantly different than what people have been discussing, if we were, if, you know, just as a kind of extreme example, if there was discussion that Vermont's future was building nuclear power plants and doing significant carbon sequestration, that's not in the model, and that's not, you know, those elements aren't necessarily in the modeling right now. What we've heard people talking about are the importance of weatherization and building energy use, electrification in the building sector and transportation sector, and those types of things. So those and the types of policies and initiatives that are both currently active and then also being considered are consistent with what's in the modeling. And then finally, the questions and some of what I'll be reviewing today are what are the Cadmus EFG team recommendations to help revise and build upon the model that we can incorporate and then present in the LEAP model that will be kind of the revised version that will be the foundation to support the climate action plan. So as I said, it's important to recognize that when I say mitigation, the mitigation scenario, each version of the model, and I'm going to talk a fair amount, I'll use the term the 1.63 model. This is the version of the LEAP model that we've been working with from SEI, and what I'll be talking about today are modifications that we're recommending that would be made to the LEAP model, which would then result in another additional scenarios or a new version of the model. But currently, this shows emissions, you know, by year, and then with Global Warming Solutions Act's targets for 2030 and 2050 and 2025. And without the modifications or without the types of changes that we're going to discuss today, currently the modeling and the mitigation scenario, the core mitigation scenario in the model does meet the emissions reduction targets. And so what I'll do, that's kind of that's a broad introductory overview. And what I'll do now is turn to each sector and talk about what the model currently includes, how it's meeting the targets, recommendations that our team has for changes to the model, and then consistency with the discussions that we've had with all of you about priorities for the cross-sector mitigation group. Let me pause there just really briefly, see if there are any comments or questions on what I've said so far. I've got about 30 slides today. So we do have time for discussion, but I'll take every now and then I'll take a little bit of a pause and just see if there are any comments or questions, and I'll let Peter or Rich or someone kind of moderate those.
Jared, looks like your hand's up.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you, David. This is a great introduction. I know that we don't have time to get into this now, but your early slides, I think at some point we're going to have a deeper discussion about this question about what guidance is and is not in the Global Warming Solutions Act with regard to how we prioritize where we get emissions reduction from. I've been reading over and over, making sure I'm really clear on the section of the Act. This is 10 VSA 592, section D2, where it talks about what the plan should include, and it talks about furthering the following objectives. And the first objective that it talks about, and this is section D1, is to prioritize the most cost-effective, technologically feasible, and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathways. There's more, but I want to start there. That is listed first.
Mhm.
Only after we talk about cost effectiveness, technologically feasible, equitable, does it talk broadly, I think, about providing for greenhouse gas emissions reductions that reflect the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. So I'm really glad to see that in your presentation, it's there as a reference point for what emissions reduction are we getting sector by sector. But I feel strongly, and I think eventually it's probably going to be beneficial for this subcommittee to have a conversation and the council to codify an understanding that while we want to meet sectoral targets, to me that is secondary to making sure we're achieving emissions reductions in a cost-effective, technologically feasible, and equitable way. I think there are some sectors where we have more readily available cost-effective win-win solutions right away, like in transportation and heating. There are some where there's just greater challenges, and it may be inappropriate to ask them to do their sectoral share, like for gross emissions reduction from the agricultural sector. So I'm not saying we're there yet, or I want to pause and have that conversation now, but I think that your initial slides beg that question, and it's something I want to flag for us to come back to.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent, and there is a slide at the end for broad discussion of some of the questions, and I think that those are very important observations.
Before we go to Brian, Brian's one of our staff technical experts on modeling purposes. Wanted to see if there are any other council or subcommittee members with questions.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, David. David, can you run back one slide, please? In 2025, it looks like you're overachieving. And can you just briefly explain if that's because the model's putting the emissions trajectory on a path to 2030? And this relates a little bit to what Jared was talking about, a cost effective. I think, as far as a cost effective path, I guess I expected that you would always be at the targets, but I think I'm misunderstanding how the model is solving this problem.
That's a good question. And the model, LEAP is an accounting framework software. There's some elements in the electricity sector where you have the opportunity to run an optimization, and so it's least cost planning. But the general framework for LEAP is that you're giving it you're defining the scenarios, and it's helping you keep everything internally consistent and tracking things by sector and these types of things. So by 2025, what's in the model currently does meet and perhaps quote unquote overachieves, but I think as people have discussed all along, the harder element is the reductions by 2030. And you can see from where we are today at over 8 million down to the 5 million by 2030, it's a pretty steep slope. So overachieving, if we were at just the 7,300 value 3 years from now, or 3+ years from now, it could be more difficult. So it's not as though LEAP has said this is the most this is the optimal kind of, it is not structured as some models might be to say you are just required to meet 7380 by 2025, give me the least cost way to do that, and don't do anything more. It's not structured in the modeling framework that way. Is that helping your answer?
Yeah, a little bit. We can go into it more.
Yeah.
Some other time, but yeah, thank you. That's a helpful clarification.
Okay. Okay, why don't go into a little bit by sector here, and then as I go through the transportation sector, Jeff Morrison with the Cadmus team is also on the call, and welcome Jeff to provide comments or additional things related to what we're looking at here. So for the transportation sector, and again, this is the snapshot of what's in the current version in the mitigation scenario of the 1.63 version of the model. The left-hand side shows emissions reductions from the transportation sector, and down below, emissions reductions from 2020, by 2030 or 36%, and by 2050, 87%. I'm just doing this, referencing it to 2020, and instead of using necessarily different timeframes in the historic, but just to show this is just to give a snapshot of what's in the model. And how are the transportation sector emissions reductions are primarily coming from EV adoption, and the graphic on the right shows the sales by thousands of vehicles by vehicle type in the different years. And so there's an internal combustion engine phase out of new sales by 2032. You see kind of the green hashed sector disappearing by 2032. So there's a significant reduction. It's an important significant reduction for meeting those overall targets. And it's primarily based currently on the adoption of electric vehicles, both for passenger vehicles and then light duty trucks. Elements that our team is recommending, Cadmus EFG team recommends for enhancements, modifications to the model, is to add elements that impact vehicle and passenger miles traveled. So whether it's through densification and smart growth, transit, travel demand management, or bike pedestrian type things, those would all reduce. In the model currently, the vehicle miles traveled by the electric vehicles were constant, and so they're not initiatives that would be reducing vehicle miles traveled. And some of the work that Jeff and the Cadmus team, there's information in the literature, and then some modeling work that they've done for some other states. We can provide kind of elasticities that look at increases in spending on efforts for densification or transit and travel demand management, and those have a percentage reduction over time in vehicle miles traveled. These tend to have somewhat potentially a longer, depends on which one of these you're talking about, but they have a little bit of a longer time frame. But we think it's important to have something that is not just the vehicle focused turnover to electric vehicles, but also kind of travel patterns and development patterns. And we want to reflect those in the modeling. We recognize that, something like a densification or smart growth study and primary research for Vermont is more complex than is going to be accomplished by October 5th or October 26th or this, obviously this year. That's a longer term important research. But what we think we can reflect in the climate action plan within the time frame we have is some reduction. And again, these will likely be, kind of phased in at a later time, but a reduction in the vehicle miles traveled and passenger miles traveled. And then the other thing is that they can provide some emissions reduction and energy use reduction, but they are not going to, they're not going to replace the importance of what's already in the model in terms of the vehicle types, the turnovers, the electrification of the vehicle fleet. That's still going to be that will provide the lion's share of the emissions reduction. And so the pathways and the pathways analysis need to continue to reflect the importance of those. And then these can also be complementary to that. Number two, and as I go through these, I'll go through these and then pause, see if Jeff, if you have additions, comments, and then we can see if there are any questions. We also, based on literature and analysis and for other studies that Jeff and the Cadmus team have done, we feel it's important to include vehicle charging infrastructure. So the types of, by type, they're different: level 1, level 2, fast charging. The number that are required as the population of electric vehicles grows and the costs, we want to reflect those. It's not going to be detailed planning for those, but to reflect some of that, they're important elements for electric system planning and development. They're important elements around equity, so that you're making sure that, say, apartments have adequate infrastructure for vehicle charging, and it's not a barrier that certain groups or geographically it's considered as well, so that you're not limiting the adoption of EVs geographically or by income class. And knowing about the charging infrastructure, the potential for managed charging, which is in the model somewhat, those are all important. So that's another important enhancement and modification that we're recommending, is to include that, and we've provided inputs on what those look like. Number 3 is that in the current model, the electric vehicle, the cost decline for electric vehicles may be a little bit conservative, and that there's good literature and increasing evidence that the crossover point for costs for electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles it may be coming quicker than is reflected in the model, and that will obviously has some impact on the customer economics, the nature of incentives that may or may not be required, the economic impacts for it. So modifying the profile of the cost declines. And then a 4th item is biodiesel viability, 100% biodiesel viability, and whether vehicles using biodiesel 100 require conversion costs for cold operations, and what those would be. Those are the primary recommendations that we're making for modifications to the transport sector. Let me pause there, Jeff. You want to provide any comments or additions?
Just a quick response to Gina's comment there in the chat. Are you referring to public charging needs or all charging? So we are proposing basically 7 types of chargers, parameterizing LEAP for 7 types, and that includes both residential and public, but also medium duty and then heavy duty. It's still going to be, probably not as granular as we would ideally like, but across the 7 types, we've got sort of costs and coefficients for each of those 7 types. So it'll get us in the ballpark for kind of total system costs. And that's probably good for color commentary. David, back to you.
Okay.
I see Liz has a question or comment.
Yeah, it's on that topic. Thanks. Jeff, does that also include an assumption for load control for those chargers? And my original question was going to be, do you need information on that? But does it already include that information? And if so, what is it?
We took what we could find as sort of an average cost. These were kind of worked out with Argonne National Lab. I don't have a specific load control technology, I think, included. It's just the equipment, it's the make ready costs, and basically the labor for installation that's included.
Yeah. Sorry, David had said that it was in part to reflect the electric system planning that you included the chargers, and that in my mind raises the percentage of load control that you're assuming for the charging activity. Is that not a part of the model that we need to worry about?
David could probably speak to the load management better than I could.
Yeah, there is that Liz?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I wasn't, yeah. So there is managed EV charging as an element that's included in the scenarios. And if you have information, I mean, we can reflect potentially the costs for, or the cost for charging infrastructure without load management, or assume that all of the charging infrastructure does have the ability for load management. I mean, it will be,
Yeah, or
is an
something in
important
between.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If it's helpful to you, we do have what we're using for our own IRP and 20-year plan. And, you know, it's consistent with work Velco and others have done. So if you do need that, we could provide you at least some information, because obviously it does change the overall electric system costs and planning to do it kind of a managed way versus unmanaged. So that'd be good. Yep. Absolutely. So my generic response to folks, if you feel like you have information that may be helpful to the Cadmus EFG team, please forward it to us. We won't, you know, we won't turn something away and say, no, this is not going to be useful. It may or may not be incorporated directly into the immediate changes, but collecting information and if you feel that there's something useful, please err on the side of sending us something along. And for transport related stuff, you can send that to me and Jeff. That would be very helpful.
Dave Farnsworth has a question.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, David. This is really very interesting. Can you talk more about your assumptions behind the different types of charging that you've looked at? The uptake in.
Yeah, I'll let Jeff talk about those numbers.
Sure. And you know, I recognize that, you know, predicting the, you know, both the future charger mix, but also, you know, the vehicle technology that can use those chargers. It's a bit of a guessing game. So, you know, what we have are basically ratios for each EV in the state. We have ratios for each of our 7 different types of chargers that change out into the future, out to 2050. So some of the charger types, you know, those ratios go down over time, some go up over time. Some are, you know, for medium duty chargers, heavy duty chargers, we're assuming that there's just 1-to-1 ratios, 1 plug per vehicle, which, you know, may or may not be right. But that's generally the approach. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just a little concerned because we know that whatever your assumptions are about the uptake, for example, in residential charging, we know that residential charging is highly elastic and that it can be managed in a very low cost way. On the other hand, we know that public charging, transit charging is much more of a challenge to manage over the course of the day. And I'm just hoping that we reflect those differences, because there are great opportunities in certain respects with parts of the charging market out there. And there aren't great opportunities, at least at this point, with other aspects of the charging market. But I'm hoping that by glomming them all together, you don't lose some of the opportunities that have been demonstrated over the last 6 or 8 years around the country with respect to managing, keeping costs down, and encouraging people to get an electric vehicle because they can charge at very low cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, they range from, you know, as Jeff was saying, the number of chargers, or the number of, you know, vehicles that a charger serves varies by type. And for some of the medium and heavy duty vehicles, I think, Jeff, correct me, but I think it's you know, kind of 1-to-1. They almost have a dedicated charger, at least to start. But then for the lighter duty vehicles, it's you serve more vehicles, and there's a mix both of the at home and the profiles that can relate to that versus the public charging. And I'm not certain if there is, this is a good thing for us to perhaps follow up, Jeff, with SEI. I think the EV charging, the managed EV charging that's in the model right now, I'm not sure if it's differentiating by charger type, because it's probably not, because basically the chargers and the types of chargers, the charging infrastructure has not been incorporated in the model to date. So this is a recommendation. How much will be able to reflect differences in managed charging profiles by type in the immediate near term, I'm not sure of, but we are going to make sure that there are chargers by type and costs associated with those are incorporated. And that's kind of a helpful next step along that path. Yep.
Sorry, David, to interrupt. Is there any geographic element to that?
No. But I think, again, it provides a foundation for doing that as we go forward. First is, well, if this is the rate of adoption, then what is the total number of, where are the vehicles, and then where would the charging infrastructure be? But first order is this is the adoption of the vehicles, and then this is the amount of charging infrastructure required to serve those vehicles. LEAP has regionality and can be, developed over time to break out things by different regions within the state. Currently, this is the statewide model.
Thanks, Dave. Maybe you should move on.
Keep moving on. Yeah, we've got one more slide on transportation, which is then back to this question of what are the consistency or gaps with the committee priorities. So the modeling, the LEAP modeling, both existed and with recommendations, I think will provide analytic support for participation in the TCI and associated initiatives, that might be, if Vermont's participating in TCI, the types of initiatives that Vermont might then launch in conjunction with that program. So something like the Replace Your Ride, or kind of income targeted level of EV, or alternative to your current single internal combustion engine, transit or micro transit, kind of smart growth and other transportation demand management and fee baits. So I think that the existing modeling supports and is aligned with those. The level of reductions that we see, I think, is relatively aligned with my understanding. Had some back and forth with Peter and Brian. Thank you for the feedback that you've given on that. Had some discussions with Johanna about the TCI program. So I think it's consistent with this as an overarching kind of, perhaps the umbrella for the transportation pathways or sections, and that there are elements that you all have discussed with us that you'd like to see incorporated that can be referenced and fall under that. There are some of what's not in the LEAP model, just so people are clear, is that something like a customer financial analysis of what's it look like for a customer to buy an EV? What are the adoption rates? What incentives might be necessary? What's the level of public cost initiatives? Those types of things. That's a little bit of additional kind of complementary analysis that we will include in our pathways report that is more of the November deliverable. We won't be able to completely design programs, but we can talk a little bit more about some of those and what it looks like. And as I mentioned before, we think that the cost declines for the EVs may be a little more rapid than is currently reflected in the model. So I would say, broad brush, that I think that the analysis that's there is consistent and helps to support the cross-sector committee priorities that we've heard. So open to feedback on that, but that's kind of where we see things stand right now. And then we should move keep moving on probably a little bit onto the building sector, but
Jared, do you have a comment on this last bit?
Yeah, I just have a question for David and Jeff as it relates to the modeling and these summary kind of recommendations around, or the alignment between some of the recommended actions and what the modeling shows. And that is, as we've followed the transportation task group's recommendations, and those have been presented to this full subcommittee, one of the key themes throughout that I don't see here, and I'm not sure if I see it reflected in the analysis, is related to increasing efficiency of the ICE fleet, the internal combustion fleet, due to following California's stricter emissions standards rather than the federal standards, and aligning with their phase out of the sale of any vehicles that are not meeting a zero emissions requirement after 2035. And because it looked like in the modeling, basically all of the ICE vehicles, all the fossil vehicles are treated the same. Is there a level of kind of refinement in the model that's actually breaking different vehicle classes out separately, where you're able to see those improvements in efficiency by following stricter and better fuel efficiency standards and those type of phase outs that places like California and New York have put forward for new vehicle sales past a certain date?
it's a good question, Jared. I think I'm correct. The model, I think, has assumptions on the efficiency of the vehicles, and there are, I think, in the mitigation scenario, there are improvements in the efficiency, but the main thing that's going on is you're phasing those out. But I think that the mitigation does include both in the baseline and in the mitigation scenario, accelerated efficiency improvements for the internal combustion engine fleet.
Thanks, David. A last question on this one. Do you?
I had a question in the chat too.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see it, Gina.
Well,
No,
it kind
you
of
go first.
reflects, it may be what Jared just said. When you're calculating numbers, were you looking at the policies that the state has adopted or will adopt, most likely adopt, such as ZEV and California emissions? And I think the answer is yes. You factored that in when you were looking at the adoption rates over time, correct? Am I making sense? That's some of the background information in calculating the adoption rates. That we have these programs in place that will bring in the vehicles and make them available, and people will buy them if we do the right thing. Or are you just straight lining the assumption that these EVs will come into the state?
I think that the model that's been built so far is, I think it's reflecting, and again, I'll confirm all of these in review with SEI, but I think it's reflecting what is, anticipated in the baseline and some acceleration of those, but it is the mitigation scenario is an acceleration beyond certainly what a baseline is for the adoption rate of the electric vehicles. And so as I showed on the, this is, electric vehicle sales would be, what's that share? It's, it's 30% by 2025, basically, and bordering on 75%, 80% by 2030, and basically phased out completely by 2032.
And that assumes Vermont participating in California emissions programs and other forcing policies.
I'm not certain if it assumes that or whether that's, it's again, is this consistent with that rather than necessarily that that's the assumption that this is based on.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, we have a fair amount. We're about a third of the way through here. So there's a fair amount, and I'll need to probably speed up a little bit. Let me move into the building sector. I'm going to do the same type of thing with a snapshot, review the recommendations. There are, because of more branches in the building sector model in some sense, there are a few more recommendations, but there are a few that are really kind of the most critical. I'll focus a little bit on those, and then talk about alignment with the discussion again that we've heard from the committee before. So the snapshot for the building sector, again, comparing to just the pace from emissions reductions 2020 to 2030 is 42% and 76% by 2050. By sector, 60% of those reductions, and it's pretty consistent both for 2030 and then by 2050, it reduces somewhat for the residential sector, but the residential sector remains the lion's share of the, is basic. Oh, sorry, I don't know why that's doing that. 60% from residential, a third from commercial, and then 7%, I think it's up to about 10% by the 2050 comes from industrial. So really the residential and commercial, and within residential and commercial, then the next slide here shows that it's space heating is the primary driver in the emissions reductions that are in the model for both commercial and industrial. So that's illustrated by the red bar on the left side is the space heating in the commercial sector, and the yellow bar on top is space heating, in the residential on the left, and in commercial, it's the yellow on the right. So you can see that residential, and then space heating within that, the reductions in space heating are associated with electrification with heat pumps, shell efficiency improvements, and there is also then in the residential sector, there's a phase out of water and cooking fossil fuels that is reflected in the current model. In the commercial sector, space heating is the most important. Primarily heat pumps, a little bit less in terms of the shell efficiency, and then a phase out of water and cooking fossil fuels also is incorporated in the current mitigation scenario pathway. So the building sector recommendations, and this is one that's perhaps more structural than some of the others, but very important given the discussion about equity and making sure that the weatherization that's going on is serving all different types of housing. We recommend that the weatherization portfolio that's in the current model did not incorporate proportionally, it underrepresented apartments and mobile homes. So there were no mobile home weatherizations reflected in the current model, and their apartments were underrepresented. And so and the other thing is that the current model, which again, as a reminder, does meet kind of the overall targets and sectoral targets, had weatherization of about 72,000 households by 2030. Those of you who are familiar with the weatherization at scale discussions know that the cumulative number that's been discussed is more on the order of 120,000. So what we've recommended is that two different things. First is that the existing level that meets the targets, 883, be rebalanced to increase the number of mobile homes and apartments that are weatherized. And so that's reflected in the top panel there, where what's in the current model is the blue for rural apartments and mobile homes. That increases, from a few hundred up to 15,000 is what we're recommending. Rural single family would decrease to keep the same number in the top panel of weatherizations. Urban apartments and mobile homes also increase significantly, and urban single family decrease. Now, that doesn't mean in the single family, you could still be prioritizing income qualified households in the single family And it's not to say that income qualification is strictly related to apartments or to mobile homes, but there certainly is a correlation there. And we feel it's important to rebalance the initial portfolio. The second panel down below, we also recommend that a weatherization at scale scenario that reaches 120,000 units by 2030 is considered in terms of its costs and the associated emissions reduction. And as that second panel shows, that would increase the number of weatherizations by household type for all housing types. So that would increase the number of rural single family from what's in the model currently, and increase them for across the board for everything. But again, with a much higher proportional representation of rural apartments and mobile homes. And let's see, Liz Bourget, who's on the EFG team and has helped quite a bit with this. Liz, are there things that you want to add at this point on this, the rebalancing or the weatherization at scale?
Sure, yeah. I guess I just wanted to add that the top graph represents the readjusted increase in retrofits for apartments and mobile homes. And the bottom includes that readjustment. So a greater proportion again to apartments and mobile homes, and also includes the 120,000 retrofits by 2030. Yep.
So thank you. A second building sector recommendation is the graph here represents heating system types by share. So this is in essence 100% share. And as we can see here, the air source heat pump high efficiency, that hatched gray bar on top, ends up serving a large share of the heating system, of heating systems. This is for all housing tenures, all housing structures, and urban rural, so residential. And our recommendation is to reflect a greater variety for residential heat pumps so that this gray segment becomes broken out by more heating system types. The reason we're recommending this is something like, there are a number of centrally ducted systems in Vermont are not, the predominant system, but there are roughly 30% of households have forced air systems, And so for those, a centrally ducted system might have a relatively lower cost for an upgrade and a retrofit and could meet 100% of that household's heating load. So we're breaking these out. I won't go into too much depth or time here, but single head system, $6,100, 40% of the load, two head system, $7,000, 66% of the load. So in essence, what we're saying is that because the air source heat pumps are such an important element in the residential market and in the retrofits, that we think breaking those out in a little more detail would be helpful right now and providing those inputs into the modeling. There are additional recommendations related to residential new construction. The current model has a useful energy intensity, so the building energy load for space heating that is higher than for existing buildings, and that's based on new construction potentially being larger, tending to be larger. So per building unit, the energy demand can be higher, but the adoption or the potential adoption of net zero code improvements will reduce the useful energy intensity for new construction. And so we recommend that be reflected as an option so that new construction, even though it's not a large part, will be significantly more efficient and have lower building loads. The timing, I mentioned that both for commercial and residential, there's a water and cooking fossil fuel phase outs. The timings for those we think need to be shifted back a little bit, and that will potentially increase the emissions a bit, but shift that phase out so that there is no more water or cooking fossil fuel use by 2040. That would allow you to have something that would either incentivize or require new sales to be electric starting in 2025 and have a 15-year average turnover. Advanced wood heating, for particularly the biofuel focused scenario. Currently, there's some renewable natural gas and biofuels, but there is not increased uptake of advanced wood heating systems, pellets and pellet boilers, et cetera. So SEI is working on incorporating basically all of these. So that's another recommendation. District heating, without getting into too much detail in the modeling, we can characterize district heating based on a cost per delivered MMBTU that can offset some of the commercial and possibly residential larger apartment buildings. The district heating would be based on kind of assumptions that it's a renewable fuel source, it's biomass fuel source, and looking at scales that would be potential increments or the amount of district heating that could be provided based on scales for systems similar to what's been considered in Burlington and Montpelier, and perhaps some multiples of those looking forward. So by 2040 or something, you could have 2 Burlington scale and 3 or 4 Montpelier scale type systems serving needs. Again, statewide. This is not getting geographically specific, but we're just using that to help frame that. Commercial, potentially a higher share by type of ground source heat pumps, and then potentially just some of the energy intensities that are incorporated in the model currently may need to be revised. And for industrial has relatively low levels of emissions reduction and improvements looking forward, and there may be opportunities to consider more in terms of strategic electrification and process efficiency options that haven't been captured in the model. So then consistency or gaps with the committee priorities. The modeling that we've done and that is with the recommendations, the modeling that SEI and the department have done, and with the recommendations that we're providing, we think will provide good, strong analytic support for, the incorporation into the climate action plan of something like the clean heat standard, which people are aware there's a working group that's been formulating a clean heat standard and working on the development of that serves potentially as an umbrella under which other initiatives like a rental efficiency initiative. We talked about the rebalancing for the apartments and mobile homes, but making sure that we're addressing rental weatherization at scale, the fossil cooking and water heating phase out, net zero new construction standards for residential and commercial. So we think that the modeling provides good support for the consideration of these as the mechanisms to reach as part of the pathways analysis. There may need to be some additional analysis for some of the industrial strategic electrification and process efficiency. But we think generally this is again, the modeling provides a good strong support for what you're looking at. So let me pause there for comments or questions on the building sector. Again, we're about halfway through. So we have non-energy and electricity sector left. And so just with a nod towards time, I'm going to take a couple questions or comments now, and then I want to leave time at the end for discussion too.
Thanks, David. Jared?
Thanks, David. Just quickly, and I'm happy to follow up about this more after, but first, I just really want to appreciate the rebalancing that you did on the weatherization side to prioritize apartments and mobile homes in low and low to moderate income Vermonters in particular, as that is incredibly important from our equity principles. I do want to just flag that, a potential difference that would just be good to look into a little bit more closely between where this is and where the EAN modeling was, which may be totally appropriate, but I just want to note it. And that is, when we did our modeling, it was 120,000 new home or new housing units,
Right.
not newly constructed, but weatherizing 120,000 housing units by 2030, in addition to the nearly 30,000 that have been done so far. So a total of 150,000. And that did not make a huge, I mean, it made a significant, but not a huge difference in terms of direct emissions reduction. I think it was like 130,000 tons by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the greater driving force of why we modeled that scale of weatherization being necessary was because at the same time, we were, just as you are, modeling a significant uptake of heat pump systems, you know, 200,000 by 2030 total.
Yeah.
And of course, as you know, there's interactive effects between those. And we were skeptical that you could get that level of heat pump adoption and heat load displacement if we weren't at the same time weatherizing those housing units to reduce the heat load. And so I just will be curious to look to see how those numbers match up between weatherization and heat pump adoption, so that we're really confident on the resilience and reliability side of things, and that we're not trying to ask heat pumps to do more than they actually can or should in terms of heating and efficient buildings.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let me keep moving if that's okay with everyone.
Yeah, keep moving, Dave. There's some questions in the chat.
Okay.
But they could be answered, that they could be answered separately, I think.
Yeah, I'm not reading the chat as we go along, but if we can, we'll review those and we can either touch on them at the end or come back to them. For the non-energy sector, the snapshot, emissions reductions from 2020 to 2030 are 47%, and by 2050, 76%. Most of this comes from agriculture. 80% of that comes from the agriculture, and 20% basically from the industrial processes. Within agriculture then, the panel on the left, of the reductions from agriculture, 80% of those are from soils, agricultural soils, which they have direct emissions and indirect emissions of methane and nitric oxide, but they also can serve as a carbon sink. And in the model currently, they've become a carbon sink by 2030. So that represents the majority of the agriculture sector's non-energy emissions. And I want to emphasize here, these are non-energy. So energy use in the agriculture sector is reflected elsewhere. Enteric fermentation and manure management also have some significant declines before 2030. I'll touch a little bit more, I'll touch on the agriculture recommendations in a second here, but before doing that, on the industrial process, the reductions are basically that are in the model currently are all reflect ozone depleting substitutes for ozone depleting substitutes. So it's refrigerant management, reducing leakage, and making sure that as they're available, alternative refrigerants that have lower global warming potentials are used, but also refrigerant management and leakage reduction. And so the others, you know, compared to the others, it's all of the reductions from that sector are coming from the ODS substitutes.
Before you go past that, David, I think it's important to note that one of the things that we've been discussing and waiting on is some specific data. And so there's been a discussion in front of the PUC about reductions, right, overall emissions from global foundries, overall emissions from their electricity use, their thermal use, and their process emissions sort of tied together. And we did not include any of that sort of reflection in here at this point because that process is ongoing. But there could be a significant reduction in emissions from the semiconductor manufacturer if that were to occur. Right. Where there would be some, as opposed to the flat line that you see here.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That's actually incorporated in, one of the recommendations is to potentially incorporate something like that as part for the CAP to see what impact that would have. For agriculture, the non-energy recommendations, the existing rate of the increased soil sequestration, may be somewhat high given the range of rates in the literature. And also as soil sequestration may not be something that continues at a steady pace as the soil takes up more carbon, the rate at which it takes up carbon may slow down. So the current rate results, as I said, it's the majority of the reductions there. It results in agricultural soils becoming a net sink by 2030. So based on the data and the research gaps, I mean, it's important to, Jillian did a good job in terms of the carbon budget. Jillian Gelford, who's part of the Cadmus EFG UVM team working on this, is our expert and has discussed this more, but we're recommending that a sensitivity case that would include zero increase in agricultural soil sequestration should be considered at least as a sensitivity, and that accompanied by further research in terms of the rates at which agricultural soil carbon can be improved. Jillian has pointed out that some of the higher rates in the literature are associated with soils that don't already have a relatively high carbon content, and the Vermont's in relatively good shape. And so our rate of sequestration may be somewhat lower than you would see other places. But for now, this, at least a sensitivity that doesn't assume that we're getting that level of reduction from the agricultural soils would be important and helpful to consider. Enteric fermentation and manure management both have reductions by 2025, and we recognize that there are feed practices and livestock management practices for I saw an article quite literally about helping cattle become trained to use the facilities appropriately, and that there's been people feel like you can toilet train livestock. I'm not sure but there was just a general article the other day about that, but there are opportunities for reductions here. We feel that by 2025, the reductions that are in the model currently are probably too rapid given where we stand. And so we're making specific suggestions for kind of phasing that out over a somewhat longer period of time. And then finally here, for manure management, the livestock population is directly linked to growth in the human population currently, and we're looking to see if there may be some alternative estimates of the population, livestock population, that could be more appropriate than just a direct proportional growth with the human population. On the industrial process, the non-energy recommendations, the ozone depleting, the ODS substitutes that we mentioned before, the reductions kind of that are in the model currently are consistent with levels from the refrigerant management initiatives that are kind of currently in place. We're looking to kind of characterize the average costs for those types of reductions based on some of the demand resource plan, the EVT DRP type estimates that have been provided, and then validate that one of the things is that I think Liz Bourget, feel free to chime in here, but my understanding from what you and I have discussed is that California has a short-lived climate pollutant initiative. They've looked at the level of reductions through 2030, but not out through 2050. So do you continue to maintain the pace of emissions reductions from ozone depleting substances, or at some point does that tail off? And so there may be some uncertainty about that, but we're able to characterize some costs that aren't currently in the model, some costs, and then perhaps some modified rates for the ODS substitutions later in the modeling, later in the time horizon. Did I get that right, Liz?
Yeah, that's right. And I guess I'll just also add that we're talking with Efficiency Vermont about projected costs of their refrigerant management initiative, and that can help inform the costs of reducing ODS substitutes emissions in Vermont.
Yep. And then, Peter, you mentioned the semiconductor manufacturing. Currently, there's some growth that's just proportional to state population. It's relatively flat, as the state population growth is as well in the model. But we recommend including the potential for at least some reductions. So the process reductions based on historic reporting, Global Foundries reports directly to the EPA on their process and then energy-based emissions, but process-based emissions, which are the use of the fluorinated gases for production purposes, has decreased. And so assuming that there's some ability to decrease emissions going forward, having something like a 50% reduction from the last year where there was, or the earliest year from which there was historical reporting by 2030 could be appropriate for consideration. So on the non-energy front, the sector, consistency and gaps with committee priorities, the existing modeling and with the recommendations provides, analytic support in the CAP for discussing soil management practices and initiatives. We note that, if you did, the sensitivity of a zero increase in the soil uptake would have an impact. And, we started by saying, yes, generally by sector and by overall, we're meeting the targets. Some of these adjustments will result in increased emissions. Others will result in decreasing emissions. We won't know that until all of the modeling changes have been made, but the soil management practices and the assumptions around that are important to consider. Enteric fermentation and manure management, also the recommendations we're making will delay the emissions reductions that are in the current model. The refrigerant management program and the ability for it to continue reducing emissions through 2030 and then potentially going forward, and costs for doing that can be reflected, and the consideration of potential targets for process reductions from semiconductor manufacturing. And I would say this is an area too where this sector has, there's good research, there's good data available, but there are a number of areas where perhaps there's less known about the costs and the potential for these different processes and for, the flux from soils, et cetera, where additional research is going to be really important and very helpful. So let me pause there for any quick comments or questions on non-energy, and then we'll touch on electricity.
David, here's an open question for you about that a number of conversations around in various contexts around the idea of net emissions in the agricultural sector, given the possibility of sequestration opportunities that exist. To date, the recommendation hasn't come out that way from the Science and Data Subcommittee, although there's a move from the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee to include that information. I just wanted to flag that as of yet that issue isn't resolved, and so relying on a net negative emissions from soil carbon may be problematic, just from a process standpoint. So just wanted to flag that for your consideration.
Okay. Well, thank you. And Peter, with the, I mean, so in that sense, the zero, that sensitivity would support that. I mean, we could set that to 0 and see the impact of that.
Yeah, I guess, well, it's an
I don't want to
it's an interesting conversation as a whole, because
yeah.
0 still includes the assumption of net emissions. And that's that, if that makes sense, right? And it still assumes that, because there are emissions from the soils.
Yes.
Period, and there is sequestration happening in the soils, but they're, so even take it to 0 rather than negative is an assumption of net. And so I think that's just the only area I see some challenge in terms of where things stand.
Yeah, and the rate of improvement in soil sequestration can be separated, is separated in the model from the direct and indirect emissions of the other gases. But we can maybe we can follow up as necessary. But I think it is an area, and again, I mean, it's great that all of these conversations are going on, and Vermont is addressing these in I think a very comprehensive and deep way, which is good. It doesn't mean we always have the answers immediately.
Yeah, no, I think it's more of a timing question, because the council as a whole hasn't sort of resolved the point. And so I think keeping it in your, as you're developing the final pieces, I think that will be, hopefully we'll have resolution by then.
Okay. Other comments before we switch here? The electricity sector, I will go through a little bit more rapidly, because in many ways, I mean, the takeaways from the electricity sector modeling is that, emissions reductions from the electric sector are kind of represented over on the left side. And they, the scale of that is in thousands of metric tons as opposed to into the millions. And emissions from the electric grid decline as gas, remaining coal, and solid waste are phased out by 2040. And our electric emissions, our grid is already relatively clean, and it gets cleaner as we go forward. In the electricity sector, I think, as everybody recognizes, the important element is that, yes, emissions are already low and they go down, but here is the growth of generation and generation by type. So there's growth in generation and capacity that's reflected in the models. So generation goes from 6.3 terawatt hours in 2020 to 9.7 by 2030, and to over 25 terawatt hours, almost 26 by 2050. Installed capacity grows from 2.6 gigawatts to 12.7. And offshore wind is a very large part of this. This is the scenario that is the locally electric resources pathway, but even in that, the largest element is offshore wind. The bottom lower yellow bar is Vermont solar, behind the meter solar. So the climate action plan will not, substitute for detailed electric sector planning, for Velco's and GMP's IRP processes and planning, et cetera, and those types of things. But the overarching messages related to the climate action plan is that electricity has, and there's been discussion about the emissions profiles for different, say for Hydro-Quebec imports, and the potential for, counting in a sensitivity emissions from Hydro-Quebec as not being 0, et cetera. So there are issues around, maybe perhaps some sensitivities, but a decarbonized grid with significant, with further emissions reductions, but more importantly, significant growth in capacity and generation planning, how to manage the peaks to provide reliability with greater reliance on intermittent renewable resources and those types of things. Those are all very detailed, extensive planning and engineering processes that are beyond what the climate action plan, should or could even try to attempt to do. But the investment levels required to provide the electricity that's associated with the growth, as we've seen in the building sector and the transportation sector, is important to consider. Our recommendations on the changes to the modeling from the Cadmus EFG team related to what was in the model, and some of these have already been. There is an aggregate level now for some transmission and distribution upgrades that's been incorporated. Managed charging and flexible loads. So I think looking at mitigation scenarios, Liz, to your earlier comment, both perhaps with and without the managed charging and what the additional costs, say, for vehicle charging with managed charging versus without, could be very helpful. And then also, as with the other sectors, being sure that as I think narratively in the climate action plan and then quantitatively and narratively in future electric system planning, we need to make sure that we're considering that the geographic inclusivity and income class inclusivity for electrification needs to be considered. It's not electrification for whoever can afford it first or only. Things like community solar access to those are important to consider. Electricity kind of consistency and gaps with the committee priorities. We think that the model will provide good analytic support for it. It already looks at an expansion of the renewable energy standard from 75 to 100% after 2032 and the potential costs and the emissions reductions associated with that. It has a scenario that places a greater emphasis on in-state electric resources, but even that, just to be clear, even that scenario, as I showed in the original slide, still has quite a lot of reliance on offshore wind resources, which are obviously out of state. And then just to make it clear, I think everybody familiar with it knows, but the climate action plan will not be any substitute for more detailed electric sector planning. So let me stop there, see if there are comments or questions on electricity. And then I have just a couple, I have just a observation, which is kind of almost even more, some observations, which are maybe prompts for further discussion. And then we can have any more questions. And we have a closing slide that talks a little bit about timeline from here forward that we will also share. But electricity sector comments or questions?
Thanks, David. Liz, you have a couple of questions. Why don't you go first, and then Dave?
Sure. Yeah, I tried to put them in chat because I thought they were more technical, but I know, I believe that you modeled different portfolios going back to the slide where you had the resources listed. And what I'm wondering is, first of all, is that true? It looks like it is. And second, did you actually go to the level of costing for the different scenarios when it comes to sort of thinking about eventual cost effectiveness and that sort of thing?
Yeah, a few different, that's a good question, thank you. And a few different points to clarify. It's the there's a multi-layered process here, and I don't want to represent currently that we Stockholm Environment Institute with the Public Service Department has done the modeling in LEAP for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And our role has been to work with that model to look at modifications for the cap. So, and what SEI did for the modeling for the electric sector is use an optimization model subroutine within LEAP that does look at costs and different portfolios to meet certain subject to reliability, certain reserve margins and emissions reductions, et cetera. So it has this is a component of the LEAP model that actually does an optimization representation, but it is, it's at a relatively high level, and you wouldn't use LEAP for, complete ISO New England cost optimization, but it's a representation that based on the installed capacity, operating costs, lifetimes, transmission distribution at a very high level. Like we said, we did recommend that be incorporated into, and it's just done at a very high level, the modeling. That's what's represented currently.
Will we see, though, in the 50-page version, if you go back a couple slides, will we see, I'd actually like to see it if possible, will we see other scenarios besides the one that you call here? And will those show any difference in relative GHG reduction or cost
They
per
do.
unit? Okay.
What I've been focusing on today primarily, in the electric sector, I shared the locally, there's a scenario that has a focus on local electric generation. There's a biofuels focused scenario, and there's the kind of the general mitigation scenario. Those are all in the current version 1.63 of the model.
Got it.
Our recommendations that we discussed today would be in a next iteration of the model that we've provided these recommendations and changes for SEI. They're working on putting those into the model. Those will be reflected in the pathways analysis recommendations that we have in our reporting out for the pathways. That reporting from the Cadmus EFG team on our pathways analysis reports, that is not going to be a detailed review of the electric sector modeling by SEI in the, so this was the slide, is this showing up now?
No, but that's okay. And just because I know others have comments, is there any difference from a GHG reduction point of view or a cost point of view in choosing to use behind the meter solar compared to just the Vermont solar PV category, which is also on there? I'm not understanding what the difference would be, and see that one in the local scenario grows quite, significantly, and the other does not seem to, and I'm wondering why.
Yeah. Yes, you would expect I think that this may be, that's a point that I have not included in this, in this set. I'm not, I think in both scenarios, growth of both behind the meter as well as, in front of the meter solar, and consideration of how those are incorporated is helpful, and that there are cost differentials between those. I'm not certain how, I have not reviewed in detail how those are represented.
How the model treats that. Okay. Well, and obviously GHGs being a major issue here. Yeah, we should make sure that is treated, and that if there's a reason to separate them, great. But if there's not, we should also consider that, because it certainly is a policy consideration here, but I don't understand why it would be a part of, I don't understand why that level of granularity would be appropriate here, given what you're looking at. So would want to. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Dave Farnsworth.
Thank you, David. I'm not sure, I may have missed it, but I'm curious if there's a chance to do a sensitivity that looks at all the demand response potential that we're going to have here. Heat pump water heaters, heat pumps in 120,000 buildings by 2030. Those are all thermal batteries that can be managed to optimize our use of the grid. That will allow us to accommodate more renewable energy. That will lower people's energy bills. Electric vehicles, obviously the same thing. You mentioned EVs, but are we modeling management of those EVs consistent with the assumptions as to the uptake of electric vehicles? Those are a lot of batteries running around that should be used, just like Tesla Powerwalls are able to be used now. And
There is some,
That's
thank you,
just
David. There
from a
is some
load, that's just from a load perspective.
Yeah,
But I think we should be thinking of all these batteries as potential supply, so we don't have to go to adjacent power systems for balancing. And we
Yeah.
don't have to run gas plants for balancing.
yeah. There is, but it's at a relatively high level. There is a vehicle to grid component. Batteries are incorporated in the electric sector, and there's a vehicle to grid element. The charging, the managed charging, I think is primarily focused on the managed vehicle charging. One of the, I mean, certainly if you can coordinate loads across different types so that you're not treating a load management for space conditioning separately from the load management for, coordinated across multiple sites and across multiple loads. The potential for that, I agree, is very significant to consider. I don't think that this has represented the full potential of that in any great depth and detail, and probably it's a little bit more, it's more focused right now on the managed EV charging. So point well taken. I'm not certain how much more depth it's going to get in that area in the current iteration, but I think that looking at managed loads broadly across all end uses and multiple sites will be very important going forward.
Thank you.
So David, moving on.
Okay, moving on. I shared at the beginning, Midwestern state with 160 million tons a year of greenhouse gas emissions, and, process with 16 stakeholder meetings where there were very little, very little in terms of analysis and actually putting numbers and or any kind of cost analysis, and even how do you get to targets. So I think that I just want to, compliment all of the efforts in Vermont that have gone on from the state, from the other actors, from everybody that's contributing to this in terms of the level of depth and the seriousness which we're taking emissions reductions from all the sectors, the potential for that, addressing equity and things. Other states are doing this, but they're not in some ways as far along as we are. I'm sure others are, further along and have been doing some of the analyses that we're not able to do yet. But I think that it's important to recognize how much we are accomplishing in that. And then the other thing that I wanted to just throw out for the committee to consider is that, as we look forward to the recommendations for the Climate Council, that what we've reviewed today incorporates two different things, the clean heat standard credits and a cap and invest for the transportation sector. One, the cap and invest raising revenues, and the clean heat standard credits explicitly saying it's not designed as a cap and doesn't have allowance auctioning and the generation of revenue. Just to think about the ways in which by sector, when there are potentially some structural differences between the approach in those two different sectors, the proper ways to help present that in a way that doesn't make it feel like either conflicting or confusing to people, that you can have different approaches in the different sectors and what the benefits and advantages of those are, and the work that's been considered to do that. The last slide we have is an updated timeline, and then just open the floor for further comments or conversation. Liz or Jane, do you want to give people an overview of where things are?
Sure.
Liz, I'm happy. Yeah, happy
Yep.
to defer to you, but happy to jump in too.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
David, you're back in presenter mode, just by the way. But so we are taking the input that you all gave us today, which we so appreciate, and working with SEI to finalize these updates, incorporate the recommendations that David walked through by midweek next week, so that we can present alongside with you to the full Vermont Climate Council on October 6th. So by then, we hope to have sort of updated information on what these changes amount to, and some further detail, and really appreciate all the feedback that you gave us today as we do that. From there, we'll be sort of finalizing that work, of course, based on the feedback that we get from the full Climate Council, and kicking off the economic analysis that will be happening over the course of October. One thing that is not in here that we did confirm with Jane is the upcoming next meeting with the Vermont Climate Council on October 5th, my mistake, Tuesday, October 5th, and then I believe it's October 26th. So I got those a little inverted. So on October 26th, we will be presenting again to the Vermont Climate Council with any further refinements, as well as the economic information that we'll be working on in October. And then all of our final reporting, final workbook, all of that is due to you all on November 15th, or by November 15th. So a lot of work to do in a short amount of time, which I know is very familiar to this group. But that is sort of the work that lies ahead. I'm happy to take any questions on that, or I'm not sure if we still have time for discussion, take any sort of questions or discussion points as we wrap up this piece of the presentation. Looks like Rich, you may be speaking, but you're muted.
Yeah, thanks. Comments on the timeline. Jane, this looks consistent with what we've been discussing generally, so I can thank you for that. Liz?
Yeah. Super quick. How will electric sector fill out the goals numbers to be consistent with the analysis shown here with all of the bars to, actually show the number of different various heat pumps and EVs, et cetera? Like, how physically will that happen and when?
The model, the LEAP model is a bottom-up demand-driven accounting model. And so the needs for the electrification and the vehicles and the building electrification that is in the scenarios is reflected as demand for the electric sector, and the electric sector's model is meeting that demand with a reserve margin.
Yeah, I'm just asking the question poorly. Like, we literally need, I think, for our spreadsheet, there's a goals column, and for electrification for all, how do we measure ourselves? And one of the assumptions that we've had is that we're measuring ourselves by deployed devices that meet the model that you all have to show the reductions can be met. So if it's 2,000 heat pumps deployed in 2026 or whatever it is, I'm looking for the concrete numbers behind all the bars. I don't know if we're going to get the Excel or whatever, but how do we get the actual numbers so that we make sure that our goals are consistent with your model?
What we will be doing is taking the recommendations that we've made on the changes to the model, incorporated by SEI into the model, and then results perhaps at the more macro level by October 5th, and then the supporting pathways analyses that we have as that next deliverable with the numbers and kind of the associated initiatives and levels that are consistent with what's in the modeling is that next level of detail. So that'll be coming after. I don't think we'll have those results. I think we'll have the results at the high level, and we can pull out results in more detail pretty quickly from that. But for those will be primarily after, I think, the October. My sense is that those will be after the first meeting in October, the first presentation. because the recommendations that we're making to the LEAP model have not been incorporated yet, or we would be, presenting the results on that. But those will be done. The timeline is for those to be done before the meeting on the October 5th presentation.
Jane, I think you had some further comments to share with us about scheduling.
I think, well, David, maybe it'd be great if you could stop presenting. That way we can see each other a little better.
Sure.
And I was just going to share that we did have a sort of meeting with SEI, TJ, David, and Liz right before this meeting, actually, sort of to ensure that we were all on the same page around priorities about what to get done first and foremost. And so our hope and anticipation is that this presentation that was given to you today will be updated for the October 5th meeting and actually have the cumulative analyses that aren't there yet, because the model will be updated with all of the additional inputs that David has been sharing with SEI. My only concern actually, and then it also became clear to SEI about the extreme tight timeline that we're now on to get dummy data and real data over to Cadmus in order to advance to economic modeling, because the next timeline after your October 5th meeting is October 26th. So the intent would be to have your materials, which are your finalized actions, going out on October 19th, and the economic modeling presented along with that on the 26th at that council meeting. There's just no room in the agenda to, period. I think someone said to me, or someone said at the steering committee meeting, that we have 4 actual council meetings left, and the 5th was the one to decide on the plan. So there is no room in the schedule to sort of not meet the deadlines as set. So hopefully SEI will come through with the analyses needed for EFG and all of you. And my only ask to David and Liz around like the reports. Liz and I started to talk about this with David yesterday, but there's been some questions I know from David and Christine specifically, but others as well, about how supportive and helpful the drafting of the report and analyses will be for the CAP. In other words, how much can you take from EFG and Cadmus and sort of plop into your sections for the CAP? And the feeling that I'm getting from Cadmus and EFG, and make sure I'm correcting this right, Liz, is these are really the technical analyses and the underpinning behind, but there'll still be a need for cross-sector mitigation staff to sort of use those analyses to support their own summaries as, for the CAP. So that's it on timeline.
All right.
This is Christine. Can you hear me?
Yes, Christine, go ahead.
I had to default to just phone due to bad signal. My apologies. So I'm not sure I heard an answer to Liz's question. Who physically enters the number of heat pumps, for example, into the spreadsheet that we all have been collectively building, and about when in time will that work happen? Or is that work not necessary to happen? I'm confused.
What I anticipate are, so if the revisions to the model made next week, I think by October 5th, it will be tight, but we can be presenting, okay, these are the high level, these are the results then with the revised model. And then outputs from that model, which would be the number of devices by year, et cetera. I anticipated that we would be incorporating those in our pathways. One of our deliverables is then the pathways report, narratives, et cetera. I think, as Jane was saying, it's So there will be outputs from the LEAP model that we can provide in Excel, et cetera, SEI and us both, working for Jane and for TJ at the Public Service Department. We can start to produce the outputs from that revised model. My guess is after the October 5th meeting, and that we want to have those that would support what you're sending to the Climate Council for the 19th. I don't think it's not going to happen next week, because these revisions in the model that we've talked about today haven't happened yet. So we can't do that next week.
If David, if I may, it is actually SEI who puts the numbers into the model. Basically, EFG shares what our findings are in terms of the Vermont landscape, and then passes those to SEI, and then SEI inputs them. And generally, SEI typically can run, provide those numbers back out.
Yep, that's great. That's super helpful. And so, Jane, I guess my question is directed to you. Will the various AAN staff who have been providing support to various subcommittees and discussion leads be able to physically be available or made available to physically take SEI's numbers and put them into quote unquote this body's spreadsheet, which is not exactly what SEI is working in? I think that's originally what Liz was asking as well.
Yeah, so the action templates that we've been using to date to update them with the more specifics from the actual modeling numbers. Yes, you have staff to support you that. It'd be interesting for me to see, since I haven't, and maybe David and Liz can share with me, and we can be concerted next week at our check-in or early next week around ensuring that that's as simple as possible for all of you and their state staff who are working on that. I hadn't made that sort of connection yet. And so, yes, you have state staff who can help you with that. And if you don't and are feeling like you need it now, Liz and Ed, we can certainly get you that. And then I'll work to sort of look at the template that we're pushing out with the CAP and see how some simple or more aligned it can be with what SEI is producing with the EFG.
Thank you. That
one thought for everybody, and this is sort of an open question. I think that sort of numeric target that we have in there was, sort of a focal point, right? It wasn't really like this is. That makes sense. I think it's sort of this aspirational thing out there. It's not like this is our driving focus. If we can approach it the way of using a specific number from the model, I just want to be clear that that wasn't really the intent immediately from the beginning, at least not the way it was sort of characterized in there. So that would be a slight change, which what I guess I'm trying to get to is we could start with a more generic aspirational target and then add specifics as we have that modeling data more refined going forward. Like, I don't think it's a critical path item to present our actions at this point.
Thank you.
Liz, and then Jared.
Yeah, it may just vary by sector. I mean, at least for us, we don't even have an aspirational one to fill in. I mean, basically, for some of them, having the number will make it much more helpful to actually have an action that makes sense eventually, rather than setting a target that may make no sense. So I think it's easily addressed. I was just wondering what the timeline was. And I think through all of that, I got an idea of where we're headed. So thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Jared?
I want to follow up on what Peter said. Well, I agree that there's some level of uncertainty in moving from kind of a pathway target or a certain kind of level of adoption for certain technologies or practices to the programs and policies that will actually achieve that. There's some uncertainty, but in terms of how far a certain program or policy will move to meeting that target, I do think that it's really important that we keep those numerical reference points in our kind of tracking and overall plan so that we have a sense of this are to add up to. Otherwise, we don't have the check for ourselves of, does this plan add up? Keeping them in there gives us the clarity and assurance that if that's what they're aiming towards and we achieve those targets, I don't see them as aspirational. I see them as necessary if we're going to have a plan that adds up to what we're required to do. I recognize that there can be some variation in there. Some targets we may fall below, others we may exceed, but it is going to have to net out, and we're going to have a degree of confidence that those are going to add up. So I agree with you, Peter, from like a process perspective. We may not need all of those before other parts of work can continue to proceed, but I do think we need those in the kind of final sets of work and as reference points in the plan so that we have the clarity and assurance that the plan adds up. At least on the mitigation.
Absolutely. I think it's more of a timing question to my mind, right? It ultimately, they will need to be in there because we'll need to know what we're trying to accomplish with a certain action or a certain pathway. What I'm suggesting is, as we tune the dials, like thinking about the agricultural discussion and the fact that there is accounting for more emissions reductions is probably feasible by 2025 in various components. Those dials are going to have to get changed, which means that there's probably going to need to be adjustment in other dials. And so setting a clear number that may change at this point probably isn't the best path to go down, I guess what I'm trying to say.
We're setting an inflexible.
Thanks to both of you. I think you're both saying something really similar. So I'm wondering whether at this point we should draw this part of the meeting to a close and see if there are members of the public who would like to address the committee.
We can't
I'd
call
like to go real quick.
Right, Jane.
Real quick. So on the agenda, we can do this as quickly as you all want, but we had on the agenda recognition of that you'll be giving a presentation on October 5th. So you have one more meeting between now and then to be prepared for that. First and foremost, the action documents that you've all shared with me, we now have them for all 4 sectors here in cross sector. I want to ask first and foremost, if I heard from Dave Farnworth already during this meeting that he'd like to make some modifications to his based on this presentation with David and Liz. So that's fine. But the expectation that would be best is that I could share those 4 spreadsheets by next Tuesday with the full council. So you could have a few days and it feels like make any revisions. And if you could get them to me by Tuesday and or confirm to us that no changes need to be made for now, that would be great. The presentation document I shared with you all yesterday, really simplistic. The intent being, if you walk through those slides, that you'll reinforce all the pathways for your sector, and then try to get through every strategy. And if you only have a couple of actions for that strategy, by all means, show them all. If there are numerous actions that you can't get through them all, please elevate the actions that you want to flag for conversation with the council. A, either you see them as potentially controversial, or B, would value input and direction as you move forward with thinking them out further. That's all in the presentation. What I might suggest for you all, since cross-sector has worked together yet independent to this point, is that you all come prepared next Thursday to run through your sectoral presentations and have a conversation here as a group, and just do that as briefly as possible. You'll be the only component on the agenda around presenting your actions. There won't be another subcommittee doing it like next week. We have 2 subcommittees, Rural Resilience and Ag and Ecosystem, but we'll also have a presentation of the data. So what I would plan for is cumulatively somewhere in the ballpark of 80 to 90 minutes for all 4 presentations for the agenda. I think that, and Marion might even correct me, because we actually already have a draft agenda that was approved by the council. So it might have the explicit time if Marion wants to put it in the chat while I'm talking. And then I'll just say one other thing for your agenda next week, in case folks don't all already know this. We had a meeting yesterday. Kaya Morris is officially on board as our equity consultant. We met with co-chairs yesterday to talk through a process and expectation for review of actions. That's going to be very dependent on prioritization, recognizing that there is a general consensus from the co-chairs as well as Kaya that we'll talk about with the council that there is no way that we will apply the scoring rubric to all actions being considered as of now, and that there will need to be a prioritization and implementation schedule considered, and that we'll really be focusing our equity assessment on those high priority, high impact, early implementation actions, because that's what we're going to want to run with right as the plan is adopted. So Kaya, if there is space on your agenda next week, recognizing you'll be talking about your presentations, the intent is for Kaya to join next week, as well as the goal is by Monday that the detailed prioritization process will go out to subcommittees, and then Kaya and I would talk about prioritization timeline, her expectation with all of the subcommittees, and schedule that work out. So that's a lot for your meeting next week, but Peter and Richard and I can think about timing and how to do it all, but those are the things that feel front and center for me right now.
Thanks, Jan. I think that 25-minute slot per task lead is maybe not all we'd want, but it's a good chunk of time to talk about each one. So I appreciate that prioritization within the council's agenda. I think it's important for us all to know kind of what the expectations are of us for the next meeting, that we're not sort of voting on each other's recommendations. We're simply sort of helping each other refine the actions and the presentations and moving those forward, if that makes sense. So it's not we as a group are not endorsing this series of recommendations from the task leads, because I think that would be a more complicated conversation, and obviously would lead to moments where we might have to change something we've already sent on Tuesday. So this is really about sort of refining the presentation. We've all seen these, we've all heard them. What things do we think are useful to present to the council?
Peter, just a quick question on that. When do you think we will have a conversation as cross-sector mitigation before the full council meeting about putting forward sort of a recommended suite of our 4 task group strategies and actions? Or are you not envisioning that? I thought we were.
The guidance that we've received from the council is that we're not doing a prioritization, well, like at this point, a prioritization exercise or a approval exercise of the task leads recommendations. The task leads recommendations are going forward to the council. Jane, if I misunderstood that or the process where we are at this point, I just want to make sure I understand. Okay. So I think it's bring your presentations, go through them. Jane, I'm assuming we're gonna keep them separate just because it'll be ungainly with so many in one, to keep them.
I think it's fine to keep them separate. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go through them and then we'll get them, if we have feedback, get those buttoned up quickly after our meeting to get them to the full council for their meeting the following Tuesday.
All right.
It's a lot and it's a lot coming together, but I do appreciate that Kaya's on board and that we're gonna have a chance to work through some of those pieces, and that everybody knows kind of where we are in the process and that we have more work to do on those as the plan is coming together.
I'll just ask with folks who are still online, it might be hard with you, Peter and Richard as well, but we might, if you're all going to go through your presentations next week, depending on how much time you think that will take, and Kaya joining and conversation around prioritization, like just a half hour extra on either end might just feel nice if we could do it as a group. But
I think
we can talk about that.
it makes sense to make sure we have sufficient time. Does a 3-hour meeting from 11:30 to 2:30 work for the team? I know it's sort of hard to answer that now, but if you have any ability to think about that, I would like to make sure that
I can poll.
Thanks, Jane. We might as well try to add the half hour. I think that's fine. And I can report to the committee that our meeting with Kaya was productive and gave me, I don't know how to say it. It gave me heart that we were going to be able to work through our prioritization and work through the equity screen in this committee productively. Anything further before we turn to public comments? All right, then the floor is open to any members of the public who'd like to address the committee. Matt, I see your hand up. I can't see everybody, so if there are others, please take an action of some kind. Matt, you're first.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everybody. My name is Matt Coda. I'm Executive Director of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. We're a trade association of energy businesses that distribute fuel. I won't take up much of your time, just 2 quick points. One is that we continue to lose gas stations in Vermont. There's a reason why there's only about 440 public motor fuel gas stations that have survived here, though, and that's because they are convenient access to the motoring public. So I encourage, as we talk about how to build out electric charging infrastructure, that we recognize the opportunity that these legacy businesses provide and where they're strategically located to all the vehicles that will be traveling in Vermont. Second point is Cadmus talked about phasing out new installations for space heating, for water and cooking of oil and gas appliances, which I assume means some sort of ban. This really wouldn't be effective outside the city of Burlington. Permits not required, of course, for single family homes when installing any type of burner, boiler, water heater, ovens, fireplaces, and where all these consumer goods are today and will continue to be transported across the Connecticut River. The clean heat standard is a much more effective tool to reducing carbon emissions on in buildings. It incentivizes the workforce and the legacy energy companies working in a competitive environment to assist their customers to reduce carbon emissions. So thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Anybody else? Anything further, Peter?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you all, and David and the rest of the EFG and Cadmus group. Thank you for that presentation. It's very helpful. It's hard, helpful than we are. Obviously, we have lots more questions. That's the beauty of modeling. It helps us start to get to refining our question. So we're going to keep working through it. So we'll see everybody next week, and Jane will poll about adding some time to our meeting so that we can get through our significant agenda.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks to EFG and Cadmus. David, that was really helpful.
Great. Thank you. Glad to do it.
Super helpful.
We're adjourned, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.